Hello there, welcome to the Off by One security stream. Sorry for being down for a couple of weeks. Life gets in the way and it's not always possible to get schedules to work out and everything. But Kat Traxler is here and she was nice enough to be my guest this week on the stream to share lots of great knowledge about all things cloud hacking. So I've had a couple of people on previously, Moses Frost, for example. I had Jason Ostrom and some others talking a bit about like general cloud hacking and some techniques as well as some automation and such. And I was just chatting with Kat about all the different like spaces and fields that she's worked in as far as like web penetration testing and cloud architecture and threat and all the different spaces, and just how long that takes and how knowledgeable you become when you're able to do all those things and what that brings to the table. So very excited to have you this week, Kat. If you want to say a few words.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Hi, everybody listening. My name is Kat Traxler. If I don't know you already, I'm a author at SANS. Co-wrote the SANS Sec 549, the Enterprise Cloud Security Architecture course, just coming out of beta. It goes through all major clouds: Azure, AWS, GCP, but really more from a best of breed standpoint, where we're not going to go through and say, well, how do you do everything in every cloud? We're going to say, well, how do organizations typically use cloud? And that is, they're going to use AWS for their workloads. They're going to use Azure for identity. They're going to use GCP for their analytics. And then we're going to break down like the best practices around architecture. So that's coming out of the pipeline. As you mentioned, Steve, I've played a lot of roles in cloud. I feel like I've dug myself a niche in cloud where I started out with app penetration testing, and that moved into, hey, what is this new cloud thing going on? Maybe I can pivot from pen testing web apps to pen testing the cloud that they're hosted on, right? I'm already there. The apps are already in the cloud. I might as well just keep going. And I found myself really fascinated by the architecture that they were surrounded by, and that moved into cloud security architecture. Did that for a few years, and now I'm actually in threat detection, building out cloud detection response capabilities. So thinking about how attackers might be abusing the cloud. My specialties are AWS and GCP. Don't talk to me about Azure. I focus on those two clouds, thinking about how attackers are going to be using and abusing the APIs, using and abusing the patterns people are typically building in, and then looking at the artifacts and how they show up in the logs and how we can detect those. So that's a little bit about me. Lots of clouds all day long, but kind of like a big, broad range of the clouds, not just pen testing architecture, but kind of a little bit of everything.
Yeah, it's great. I had name is slipping my mind, Corey Ball on a couple months ago talking about API hacking, and he was saying that 80% of traffic on the web is API traffic, which I didn't know that, and that sounds insanely high. But that, I've had so many conversations with people just having taught penetration testing and doing it for over a decade, well over a decade now, and how like COVID sped things up as far as like the transition into the cloud. Some organizations were hesitant, and just kind of really trying to understand from a penetration tester's perspective, if I'm someone who has a lot of experience doing traditional pen testing, whether it be hacking network devices like routers and switches, or going after cryptographic implementations that are weak, like just basic web app stuff like SQL injection and cross-site scripting, and then of course using the different vulnerability and exploitation frameworks like Metasploit and all the others that have come out. Like, so just more of a just traditional when you think of network penetration tester. So if I'm someone like that, and I'm realizing I really need to ramp up my skills, and obviously there's the three big players in the cloud, but then there's many others as well. And then of course we've got AI coming out and Web3 coming out and all this stuff. Like, what would you recommend someone like myself, like where should I focus to kind of get up to speed and be effective as quickly as possible?
That's yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are finding themselves in that position and spending a lot of time and resources in the traditional network penetration testing, and then thinking, this cloud thing is sticking around. It's not just a phase, right? I was benefited by my background by being, I didn't really do any network penetration testing. You know, I think I used Metasploit twice. Like I was pure web apps. And when you're pure web apps, you're layer 7 all the way. It's layer 7 HTTP APIs all day, every day. You move into the cloud. What is the cloud but layer 7 HTTP APIs all the way down? So if you're coming from, you know, a web app perspective, you might have an advantage. If you're coming from a traditional network background where you're thinking about multiple layers of the OSI, you might need to actually narrow your thinking and think of it as it's actually simpler than you think. You know, a good start is to play around with some of the, you know, there's some, you know, purposely vulnerable infrastructures to play around with, like flaws.cloud, right? That'll get you, you know, your feet wet. But, you know, the first thing to remember is it's not magic. It's just HTTP requests. That's, you know, as soon as I realized that set me off into really understanding how the cloud was put together.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. I just grabbed that flaws.cloud. I've never heard of that, so I'm just pasting that into the chat there. Yeah, interesting. So, like, is it beneficial? Can you start just at the attack layer, do you think, or should I be going and reading up on basic cloud secure essentials, like to understand just the technology in the cloud and containers and what all the different pieces are?
Well, I mean, containers is a whole nother thing, right? Like when I needed to learn containers, I asked a friend of mine who is pretty big into container hacking. I was like, look, containers are also not going away. I need to understand what's happening. Where do I start? And they were like, look, don't just start going to hacking containers. Make sure you understand Linux primitives first, right? Yep. Then you need to understand the orchestration layer. Then you can understand the containers. So, and that's actually completely separate from the cloud. I would put the container hacking completely separate from CSPs, which is Amazon, AWS, Azure, completely separate from, you know, the cloud native orchestrations and Dockers of the world.
Yeah, and then I know like there's, you know, Terraform is a big language used, and as well as other languages and such used for automation and all. Like, it's a lot. It's a lot of information. So I guess I'm trying to understand, like, where would I start? And playing around in those environments, like you said, the flaws.cloud, absolutely. And then just thinking out loud as I'm going through this in my brain. Like,
let me ask you something, Steve. Have you ever learned a language without having a purpose behind it? Like, let's say you need to know Go. Have you ever just sat down and gone through a Go tutorial and learned Go? Or is it more likely that it was attached to some goal or project?
Yeah, I personally usually start it like when I was learning, let's say Python coming from C++. It was like, I want to do something specific that I heard it might be easier in Python. So I had a purpose. Yeah.
A purpose. Yeah. I've never been able to learn any programming language, say, well, you know, maybe like I read up on the basics. Okay, this is what they consider an object. This is how they do strings, yada, yada. But I've never been able to learn any kind of language well, unless there was some goal behind it, right? So I recently built a tool. I knew Terraform fine, but having to do this kind of larger project, now all of a sudden, you know, I'm a whiz at Terraform because I had a thing to do. So if you want to learn about hacking containers, you know, you need to think about what you're wrapping that up in a project, really, in order to solidify it.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good point. Do you see like when you look at Google Cloud, Azure, and AWS, do you see any specific technology or vendors using one cloud solution versus others? Is there something like Google's better at than AWS?
Yeah, I mean, I'm unashamedly, non-secretive, Google fangirl. I hack on Google. I will call them out for vulnerabilities, but I think overall they do have a better security posture. I think they do their shared tenants better. So when you have like a shared system, say, a containerization system where it's multi-tenant and you're sharing a space with another consumer, they do that kind of isolation better than Azure, absolutely, who's just rife with exploits that are crossing the tenant boundaries. And then AWS is sort of an outlier as far as IAM is concerned. If people on the call have learned their first cloud through AWS, I'm sorry, because they do IAM completely different than GCP and Azure. They have a completely different way of looking at principles and roles and how those permissions cascade than the other two. So you might actually be in a little bit of a disadvantage starting with that one rather than either of the other two.
Yeah, interesting. And it's funny, there seems to be a lot more information out there about AWS and Azure in relation to hacking and security in general. And I don't know why necessarily that is. I don't know if it's market share and that's the reason, or like you said, the security posture and such at Google. I mean, pretty much everywhere, everything that Google does is very security oriented.
Yeah, let me just share with you one paper. If you look up peach, like the fruit, peach and then Wiz, WIZ, peach Wiz security, you'll come across a paper that the good folks at Wiz put together. So it's www.peach.wiz.io. And it goes through the different technologies that are used in tenant isolation and how those boundaries should be constructed. So from like how you should construct VM isolation, how you should construct containerization isolation, and then how network isolation should be constructed between the different hosts. And this is all just how that should be done kind of like in the back end in these multi-tenant systems. And this is kind of like a culmination in their understanding of how these multi-tenant vulnerabilities have come into play. They've both, between them and Orca, they put kind of a series of multi-tenant vulnerability issues in Azure, for Azure. And then this paper is kind of a culmination of that, of like, well, how should we do it right? So give that paper a read to kind of understand what isolation looks like in multi-tenant services.
Definitely, for sure. All right, I have one more question from you. And if folks watching, listening, if you have questions, please do post them. But I have one more question, which is like, I'm trying to think of how to word it, but is it more rewarding, or are there more options available, more things exposed, more attack surface exposed from coming directly from the internet into a cloud provider or into what's exposed from an organization that has residency in the cloud and are exposing outward? Or if I'm hacking inside an organization and I get control of a user's system, kind of using that as a pivot into the cloud with obviously different permissions and such set up, like, do you see one way more like beneficial than the other?
So the question is like, do you see attackers moving from cloud on-prem or from on-prem to cloud?
Yeah, or just internet to cloud, like straight from the internet, like hacking into.
Well, I asked maybe a similar question to a friend of mine who does a lot of Azure hacking, because Azure has this very tight relationship between on-prem systems and their cloud systems. And when I say like tight relationship, what it means is they have a bunch of certs in on-prem that are used to authenticate to Azure AD. And so you have a lot of these interconnected systems between the two. And I was like, friend, what are you seeing? Are you seeing threat actors go from like the internet to the cloud and then to on-prem systems? Is it going top down, or is it going from they're getting it on-prem and then they're going up? Mm-hmm. And he just said both. He said whatever happens. He said it's whatever happens to be easier at the moment. The possibilities for securing your environment in the cloud are there. The levers are there. You can do it. It's just there's so many goddamn levers that it can be just a monumental task for even the most sophisticated organizations to tackle. So that's what we're trying to tackle with the security architecture course, to try to give people an understanding of how those components are put together. But it can be very overwhelming to say, well, how do I not only replicate my on-prem controls, but how do I make it better? Because I know my on-prem is on fire. I know that is a dumpster fire. So I don't want to replicate my dumpster fire to the cloud. I want it to be better. And it could be better. There's the potential. We just need to know how to put the widgets together.
Yeah, for sure. It's quite large. Great answer, though. So I guess if you want to walk us through something, that'd be awesome. And I'm going to check and see if we have questions while you're doing that. I'll go ahead and share your screen if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great.
Yeah, I just, I wanted to spend a few times going over some GCP security stuff, because I know that out of all three clouds, this is the one that maybe folks are not as familiar with when it comes to AWS. There's a lot of information out there, Azure, but GCP is my personal favorite. I love GCP, and I love just sharing knowledge about it. I have a very small blog. See if I can pull it up here with just some little TLDRs on Google Cloud Security. If you look up my name, Kat Traxler, and then taste the IAM, you'll come to a blog, kattraxler.github.io. Just some basic information about what are roles, what are users, what are service accounts, what is a resource hierarchy, because you can't attack what you don't know, right? You need to understand how this resource hierarchy is put together. You need to understand how the resources talk to each other before you can efficiently attack it, before you can secure it, before you can monitor it, log it, all of those things. So I put together this quick diagram for everybody, because this is one of the most fundamental things about Google Cloud that trips people up, and is different than AWS, and is one of the most unique attack paths, and that is impersonation. So on the left-hand side here, see if I can close out here, or move this over. Left-hand side here, I'm talking about all principles. So I'm talking about everything that can have permissions in Google, from a service account to a user. You can assign an entire domain. You could assign the offbyonesecurity.com domain permissions. You could assign workload identity pool permissions. Any principal that has permissions can then in turn impersonate or act as a service account, which then in turn, by impersonating or acting as a service account, you then have the ability to use the permissions assigned to that service account. So I wanted to show you a little bit, just briefly, what that looks like. I'm going to pull up my, let's see here. Oh, I was doing something crazy here, wasn't I? All right. Let me just log in here. Actually, I think I'm logged in. Let's look at the service accounts we've got.
And someone asks, well, when it makes sense to answer, what are the most common cloud flaws that you come across, just the ones that you see over and over again?
I mean, the one that everybody, thinks about, talks about, is kind of the biggest point to monitor is open storage. And there's a bunch of different ways storage can be open. I can probably pull some of this up real quick here. How many times have you seen an open S3 bucket, an open storage bucket hit the news?
Yep.
One of the reasons is because there's a couple different ways to configure access. Like I can show you the permissions here. This is true in both AWS and GCP. There's IAM level permissions, which says like I can have access, right? Here are all the permissions that can have access. Here's all the principals that have access. But then there's also this thing called ACLs, access control lists, which if you're doing network pen testing, you might be familiar with. There are these two competing ways of granting permissions to objects. They don't talk to each other. If one grants permission and the other one doesn't matter. So what these are kind of just like a legacy way of controlling access to objects. Again, AWS and GCP both have it. This is one of the big reasons why we've had these open S3 buckets. It's because it won't necessarily be open per IAM roles. We'll just have a weird ACL in there that's granting access. So if I switch to fine-grained, which Google's going to yell at me and saying, this is a bad idea, don't do this. Okay, so if I switch to fine-grained, I can then add an ACL that would say like all users can have access to an object on the ACL. It won't necessarily be here, but it will be on their ACL. That makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, ACLs historically, I just go straight to like ACLs on routers and such, and how easy it is to make a mistake. Or you look at a firewall policy and there's like redundancy throughout, and something that totally contradicts an earlier statement.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in this case, the recommended control is to just turn them off.
Yeah.
Turn them off. Don't use them.
Someone watching named Marat says hacking AWS cloud is mostly due to the overly permissive roles, policies, entities. Is GCP the same?
Yeah, I mean, here one thing we can talk about here. Well, let's get into the service account example first, and then we can talk about some kind of like overly permissive things. Service accounts. All right, so here I have a service account. I created this within this project. Let's see here, dig into it. Details. And I'm going to grant it access to at the project level. So let's see here. Roles. Organization. G-code IAM. Projects. Add policy binding. All right, so let's add some permissions here. All right. So add some permissions to the service account at the project level. Project ID. This one. And then who's going to get it? We're going to have the service account. And then we're going to give it the, I don't know, we'll give it some role. Policy modification for binding run, yada, 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 yada. What if we can do this on the, let's just do it on this here. we'll say, give this service account. Assign it some random rules. Cool. So that service account now has permissions. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Jacob. I just did it on the GUI. All right, so now let's impersonate the service account. So I'm going to say like storage, actually, say gcloud compute instances list. So we're going to list the instances, but we're going to say impersonate service account. So impersonate that service account. GCP. Be able to impersonate the service account. Yes. So I need what it's saying is I need the token creator role on the service account. So let's go over to the service account. Make sure I have permissions to impersonate it.
I feel the demo gods watching.
All right. Let's grant access. So let's grab myself. Token creator. Save. Okay. Access. Token creator. Save. All right, let's see if this works. Might give it a second. It takes a second to propagate, but let's just see what it tried to do. So this is the important part that we'll take a look at. What it tried to do is when I'm impersonating a service account, it called this API, this IAM credentials API, and it passed through the service account. It said, hey, IAM credentials API, here's the service account, generate an access token for that service account. Mm-hmm. And what it did was it passed through, and it did not do it because I think the rule needs to propagate, but as soon as it propagates, it will generate an access token for it. Another one we can take a look at is the default compute API, the default service account. So if we look at compute, let's look at compute engine real quick. I have not used any compute instances in this project. This is a brand new project I just created. So one of the interesting things about that is that with Google, you have to enable all the APIs. You can't just use everything. So I'm going to hit the enable button. It's going to take a second. And while it's turning on the API, what it's doing in the background is actually creating a default service account. The service account is going to now be created in this project. And when I go ahead and create instances, those instances are going to be used as the backing identity for my compute. This is going to be really attractive to hackers, this default compute service account, because it is really privileged. And if you have the ability to impersonate it, you can use all of those privileges. So just by pressing this little button here, it's going to generate a really privileged hotspot in the account.
What would be the right thing to do from a defensive perspective to make it so it's not as valuable?
Well, there is an org policy constraint. We can take a look at this, which prevents the creation of that service account. The unfortunate part of that is that then that, adds a little bit of friction to your development process. You then have to manually create a service account, and then you have to manually give it permissions. You have to think about, well, what does my compute instance actually need to do? It's still a good pivot point for attackers, right? It's still kind of a sitting duck there to use, but it's not like incredibly permissioned just out of the blue. So Google org policy constraint.
And is it the age-old issue where everybody wants stuff to work out of the box, and to harden things it takes work and knowledge to do so, and so a lot of people don't bother going through and locking things down, so they just stay kind of in their default mode where it's way too powerful, permissive?
Absolutely, yeah. And just taking a look at like the permissions that this service account will be granted out of the box. It's granted the editor role, something like 7,000 permissions. This was on my screen before here. You just say, like, these are all of the permissions that the service account is granted just out of the box. And some really kind of nasty ones in here. I mean, there's a lot of nasty ones, but like the worst one, in my opinion, is this one. So this is service account act as. That will allow the compute service account to impersonate other service accounts. So if you can impersonate the compute service account, you can then expand that impersonation path beyond, because it has the ability to generate access tokens for other for anything else in the project, I should say. So let's see if that service account's created yet. Okay, so no VMs. We don't have to create a VM. We just enabled the API. See what we got in service account land here. Yep, so we have our default service account that's been created. If you notice, there's no access keys generated for it. That's a really great feature of Google, that you pretty much, unless there's an extreme situation, you pretty much don't have to generate long-lived access keys. You can pretty much just operate with the OAuth. So let me grant myself permissions, principals with access to the service account.
I mean, it's just insane to me how you're just doing a small number of things, but the amount of command line syntax and the amount of, like you said, things listed, or 7,000 or whatever things accessible. It's insane. Like,
yeah, I mean, there's a lot. So this finally did. My role is finally propagated. So I have the ability to impersonate that first service account that I created. See, we got Jacob. That act as granted to the GCSA can really be interesting when there are essays in that project that have IAM bindings on other projects. Yep. Yeah. So yeah, he did a great comment, Jacob. So what we're kind of showcasing right here is just permissions within a single project. This default compute service account that was created for me has the ability to act as any other service account within this project. But that's just kind of like the default creation. You could certainly have another project that you can add permissions to. You would have another project in another organization. It really doesn't matter because of this concept of resource-bound permissions, where I'm showing you these permissions here, and you might think these are all the permissions that you could have in the project. I think that's the idea, is that, well, these are all the permissions that exist in the project. But really what I'm showing you is the project level permissions, because in Google, as in with Azure, all permissions are bound to a resource, and the project is a resource. Another thing that's a resource is the service account. So here, I'm going to click into here. I'm going to go into permissions. And what I'm showing you here are the additional permissions that are bound to the service account. So when I'm showing this to you, where I can say any principal can act as a service account, this is the binding at a resource. I could swap this out for, project. I could say that they could have the act as permission on the project. And then what that means is that they could act as any service account in the project. Right? This could just start multiplying, which then could give them access to any resources here. It also could mean that, see, that's one Google project. There could be this other Google project over here that they have some permissions on to, maybe on compute. And so there could be something like that going on. So you could just keep chaining those abilities to generate tokens. And so this is just the ability to generate an OAuth token, the ability to generate an OAuth token, the ability to generate an OAuth token. And this can just expand out between different projects and different organizations kind of infinitely.
So dumb question, because cloud hacking is one of my weaknesses. Like, how would I become that role? Like, how would I get that?
How would you get the permission to act as something?
No, how would I become that user in the first place? Like, hijack that account?
Right. So if you were, here's kind of the starting point, is any of these principles, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the kind of interesting principles is called all users. That would be commonly a misconfiguration, but sometimes on purpose. So you are already in the all users group. Congratulations, Steve, and the rest of the world. The workload identity pool is an OIDC integration. So you could become a workload identity pool from, say, maybe compromising a GitHub repo. Mm-hmm. So you could say GitHub repo, compromise a GitHub repo, which gives them ability to access a workload identity pool. Right, so this could be your target right here. Service account. This could be a web application vulnerability on a compute instance. So you could have a SSRF issue, which allows you to pull the tokens for the service account. We already know that the default service account for compute instances has the ability to act as everything in the project. So that's golden. So if this is, SSRF, that's a good starting point. User accounts, you can just say phishing. There's going to be a lot of in plain text tokens on systems, right? So I've been using the gcloud command. That's all going to be in your .gcloud, sorry, .code your .gcloud folder locally, right? So you can find those in, endpoints. You're going to find those on VMs running gcloud or the SDK. So, locally cached creds,
Sure.
efficient.
So standard methods of getting access to someone's user account and then hoping there's a misconfiguration that allows you to act as something else, right?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so what the biggest lesson I'm taking away is misconfiguration is a big problem in the cloud. So, and things are too permissive.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, everything I've showed you is not a misconfiguration. This is
Feature.
SOP. Yeah, this is SOP. So
Yeah.
So I think, now that I've kind of run through what it looks like to act as, I wanted to maybe just show you really quick. I put together a diagram on one of a new attack technique that came out from Orca. I don't know if you saw this, all bad build.
Mm-hmm.
So this was kind of building on a lot of Google research recently on abusing cloud build, specifically abusing the cloud build service account. And they kind of had a unique finding in there that allowed them to kind of use some of the permissions automatically assigned to the service account. And I can show you cloud build real quick. Cloud build is the continuous integration as a service product from Google. I use it a ton to build my code from GitHub, build it from GitHub, and then deploy it out as a cloud run, deploy it out as a function. It's actually a fantastic product. But there's this kind of well-known issue with the service account that is used in the background to perform some actions. So if you're thinking about it, what does a build process need to do? A build process probably needs to read, write, and update from a repo. Right? If you're thinking about it, any deployment pipeline is going to have to build that package, write the image to a repo, pull the existing image, see if there's a difference. And so this service account that's associated with Cloud Build is automatically granted these permissions to your registry. And this is unique to your project, but it's automatically granted permissions. So what the Orca people figured out was kind of interesting. And I kind of highlighted it in red. This was the new components to their research, was that they could send a build to Cloud Build and tell Cloud Build to actually execute some gcloud commands. It's kind of a tricky thing that's been around for a few years, actually. As a regular user, you can't act as the Cloud Build service account. It's not like this where you can actually generate a token for it. But sneakily, you can send a build to it and say, execute these gcloud commands for me. So it's kind of like a sneaky impersonation. So what Cloud Build will do happily is in the background, it'll grab a builder image to execute these gcloud commands. And what it will do, what you can ask it to do, is to read and write images from the repo and then write what it finds to a storage bucket, right? So you can actually get the output of whatever you want to a storage bucket. You can update the policies for the repo. You can pull the images and modify the images and rewrite the images. Anything that you can kind of do locally, you can send as a Cloud Build YAML file and ask Cloud Build to do it for you.
That's interesting. What are your thoughts around that?
What are my thoughts on it?
Yeah, like,
Well, they've been building on some existing research. I think this idea first came out in 2020. So they're first off, I don't think they did a really good job on their article crediting the history of this.
yeah.
But if you know that this has been around for a while, okay, it's been around for a while. I think that it's a feature, not a bug. It's in order to submit a build to Cloud Build, you have to understand that if you're going to trigger a build, that also means that the person who triggers it, this Google account, is going to have all the permissions assigned to Cloud Build. And architecturally, I don't see a way out of that. I don't see a way out of this scenario. Just a little screenshot here of all the additional permissions you can assign the Cloud Build service account. By default, it has access to your image repository because that's going to be ubiquitous no matter what. But then if you also think about it, Cloud Build can deploy to Cloud Run, deploy to functions. It can deploy all sorts of platforms. So you can then go ahead and enable, disable access to all sorts of other different products. This might be the best we come up with for Cloud Build, and just one of those known issues that if you get permissions, if you can get permissions to trigger a build, you also have permissions, all the permissions that the Cloud Build service account has.
Yeah.
We can take a look at them right here. So I enabled the Cloud Build API. Let's take a look at where the permissions are. You have to click this little box that says included Google provided grants to see it, because it is not a Google managed service account. I'm not even actually seeing it in here. I might need to create a build. So if you notice here, there's only 3 grants, and then there's a couple more. So what that showed was this additional one and this additional one. And those service accounts are going to be managed by Google, not living in your Google project, but having permissions into your project to perform various tasks.
So you can see what Marat said there.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I mean, this is the same issue that we have in AWS. So, yeah, I would have hoped that people at this point would have said, yeah, if you can submit a build, that's a pretty serious issue to begin. That's a pretty serious permission to begin with. But maybe we can just be even more clear that what that really means.
That's pretty fascinating. I'm gonna continue to just try and do my thing and avoid all things cloud. No, I'm just kidding. Just count on the expert.
Stand for too long.
Well, it's funny because I always talk about like in class where some people avoid learning how to program their whole life. Some people avoid learning how to deal with cryptography their whole life, and you can get away with it, but it limits you and such. So it's just it's a great thing about security. It's never going to run out of stuff to do. But okay, well, is there anything else you want to share, or any final parting words you want to give folks who want to get up and running in cloud pen testing?
This is really all I wanted to show you. I really wanted to give everybody a good overview of service accounts, impersonation, and then kind of like a practical use of attack of the Cloud Build service account.
So I heard you're doing something at DEF CON. Is there anything you can share, or just saying, yeah, I'll be there at DEF CON?
Yeah, no, I'm going to be at the Cloud Village. Schedule's not up yet, so keep your eyes open for that. I'll be releasing a tool If you've ever wanted to attack the clouds, if you ever wanted to attack AWS from GCP, I got you. Yeah, so new cloud attack tool / detection generation machine. Come take a look at it. It's probably been in the works for about 1.5 years now.
Oh wow.
So yeah, I'd love to show it to you if you're around.
Yeah, I'd love to have you back on if you're available after you release it at DEF CON and have you show it to us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
That'd be awesome. Thanks so much, Kat. Have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.